Let's work through a brief scenario. I have my domain, rtsnetworking.com. Now let's say our OU structure, now mine is not exactly this way, but I'm going to say I have an OU named RTS Computers. We have an OU named RTS Users. I mean, you can name these anything you like. That'll vary company by company, but typically something that makes sense. Now, under this RTS Users, I may have this broken down by department. So I have an OU for sales, marketing, human resources. I'll say HR. Now, why would I ever choose to do it this way? Well, one reason, if all my users need a specific setting, one option is to apply a GPO to this OU. By default, when you apply a GPO, through inheritance, it applies to all the locations under where the GPO is linked. So if this GPO is linked to this RTS users, it's going to filter down and apply to users in sales, marketing, HR, and it's going to go all the way through that structure. So this is why the planning of this is so important. Now, you certainly could have just created not a sub OU or child OU, they're sometimes called, for sales, marketing, HR. You could have had those here, not as part of a hierarchy. But if you were to do that, you would have had to take that GPO and you would have had to link it to each of these individually. So in many instances, it would make sense to have a hierarchy like this. So you have one place you can apply the policy, then the policy flows down. To think of this in non-technical terms, let's say we have a lot of sales data. So I'm just going to name this folder data. Now, I know that an OU uses a folder icon. That's because the concept is exactly the same. Well, let's say you have this folder, and I'm going to say it's finance data. But what happens is you get thousands, tens of thousands of pieces of financial data every year. And often when people need to see this data, they want to see data from January, February, March. Well, a common solution for that may be to have a subfolder named January, another named February. All financial data reports for February go into the February folder. Well, when you do that, you can now assign permissions for your users at this finance data folder level, and those permissions apply all the way down through that structure. That is exactly the same concept as group policy. Many places Microsoft uses this, where you have levels of control, but you apply permissions or policies at a top level, and it simply works its way down through inheritance all the way to these lower levels. Exactly the same concept. So here, that policy is applied, as we said, and now sales, marketing, HR get that policy, but it's only linked one time to that parent OU. Now, the scenario. Right now, you have all of your desktop computers, well, we'll call them workstations. And you have all of your mobile computers. Well, I'm just going to say laptops. They are all in this RTS Computers OU. So there's not sub-OUs or like the child OUs or anything like that. You just have thousands of computers in that location. Well, someone comes to you and says, we want to control wireless configurations on all the laptops, but we want to do that through group policy. And we also want to encrypt the hard drives on all of our laptops. And we want to manage those settings through group policy, but we want neither of those to apply to our workstations, or like our desktop computers. Well, now you find yourself in a pickle. You cannot create that policy and link it directly to RTS computers because it would also apply to your workstations and it would apply to your laptops. Well, take a moment to think about a possible solution where I could have my workstations and laptops easily have different policies apply. Maybe that was enough time to think through. My solution, under RTS computers, create a sub OU for workstations. Create another for laptops. Now, whatever settings that need to apply to laptops, you simply link it directly to that laptop's OU. Pretty straightforward process to actually manage. Well, let's put a face to that in the interface itself. Back on my domain controller, there are two things we can do. Well, two ways we can create these OUs. Now, the first to me seems kind of weird, but when I'm in group policy management, you can actually right-click your domain, and there's an option to create a new organizational unit. Well, let's say we do that, and I'm going to name this RTS Computers. That OU shows up here. If I were to go back to Active Directory Users and Computers, and I'm going to click on my domain, RTS Networking, and I'll just choose Refresh, but you'll see it's in the list. So you could have created that in the Group Policy Management console, or you could create that here in Active Directory Users and Computers. I mean, if you go to New, as we did earlier, organization units in the list. So either place, you are free to create that. Now, while we have this window up, one more thing to be aware of. I'm going to put these windows side by side here. When you look in this list in Group Policy, you see the domain RTS Networking. Then you see the Domain Controllers OU, the RTS Computers, and you see the Sales OU. Well, then the rest is Group Policy specific things. When I look in Active Directory Users and Computers, I see the same three OUs, Domain Controllers, RTS Computers, and Sales. So the same three OUs show up. What you will never see in Group Policy will be these containers. The users container, the computers container, notice they will never show up here. The reason? They're not organizational units. It is impossible that I could create a policy and decide that I want it linked directly to this computer's container location. You simply can't do that. The policies that will apply to the computer's container would have to be set above, like at the domain level. But there's nothing you could do to link a policy directly to built-in computers, users. You simply can't do it. Now, the way we know they're containers, the official way, is because it says it's a container. You'll see users, the computers, they just say container for type. The only ones that say organization units are the ones we created. Sales, RTS, domain controllers, or organizational units. Now, I think the easiest way is to look at the icons. If there is this, it's actually a book inside the folder icon, that denotes it's an organizational unit. If it's a blank icon inside, like the folder icon, if that's just blank like it is for users, then we know it's not an organization unit, it's simply a container. Now, built-in does say built-in domain. That's a default container that's natively built in to Active Directory. It's not an organization unit, but they don't call it a container either. They just call it built-in domain, but not an OU, so nothing you could do to link policies to that location either. Well, if we put this back in full screen, my group policy management here, if we wanted to finish building that picture, I have the RTS computers. I could create an OU named Workstations. I could create another named Laptops. Now we have our parent OU, we have the child OUs. Now if we were to look at that in Active Directory Users and Computers, that structure, when I refresh, will be reflected here. So if I expand RTS Computers, you'll see Laptops, Workstations. So now, if I were to join a new laptop to the domain, I could simply move it to this Laptops OU. Now by default, anytime you join a computer to the domain, it goes to this computers container by default. But let's say we just created a new computer. And I'm just going to call it RTS Client 02. I could simply right click and move, or as I typically do, just click and drag. And now that computer's in the laptop's OU. So if I created my policy that configured wireless networking and hard disk encryption, make sure it's linked to the laptop's OU, and you know that computer will get those settings. Computers in the workstation's OU would never get those settings because, again, the policy would only be linked to that laptop's organizational unit. Now, for the policy itself, if I go to this laptop's OU, I'm just going to right-click, create a GPO in this domain and link it here, and we will name it Mobile Security Settings. So you'll see it, as we saw before, shows up under Group Policy Objects, but it also shows up under my laptop's OU. Now I can simply right-click that and edit. Now again, our concern is not so much the individual settings, just more how this works. Because you could have literally 3,000 different scenarios for working through individual settings. But I'm going to expand computer configuration, policies, Windows settings, security settings. So the two settings we referenced, if I adjust this a bit, you'll see wireless network is in the list. So very similar to configuring like a wireless network in your home environment, I can right click this and I can choose to create a new wireless network policy for Windows Vista and later. I'm going to name this policy RTS Wi-Fi. Here, under this profile name, SSID, I'm just going to click Add. And then it'll ask me what type of wireless network do I want. Now again, not really our concern, but infrastructure is a wireless network that uses an access point. Ad hoc is a computer-to-computer wireless connection. So you're not on a network or anything like that. You just are talking from one computer to another. That's rare anybody does that. Infrastructure is what you always want. That'll have an access point. Then you can connect to the network through that. Well, here it says, what's the name of your SSID? Now, SSID or Security Set Identifier is really the name of your wireless network. I'm going to name mine. We never want to name it something that lets people know exactly what it's for. Like, I would not name it RTS because anyone nearby that detects that would know exactly who it belongs to. So I'm going to name mine Aquaman. Very similar to a home network. Connect automatically when this network is in range. Connect to a more preferred network if available. Connect even if the network is not broadcasting. Whatever settings you believe appropriate. For the security, very much like a home network again, just what type of authentication do you want to use? WPA, WPA2? What type of encryption do you want to use? So that really has nothing to do with group policy. Whoever implemented your wireless network would have determined authentication, encryption, and all these other settings. All we're doing in group policy is defining those configuration settings so they can apply to all these computers. Well, if I click OK for that and OK, we know this mobile security settings policy is linked to the laptop's OU. So that wireless network we just defined would apply to all the computers in that laptop's OU and only computers in that laptop's OU. Pretty fascinating. The other setting I referenced was hard disk encryption. So to take a look at that, I'm going to collapse my Windows settings here, and I'm going to expand administrative templates, and I'm going to go down to Windows Components, and under Windows Components is BitLocker Drive Encryption. This would have all the settings related to hard drive encryption. If I go to the operating systems, here I could define any settings that I wanted to apply to my operating system drive. So you'll see settings like require additional authentication at startup, things related to PIN numbers. So if I wanted to require a PIN number every time you start your computer just to authenticate to this BitLocker hard drive encryption service, I could manage all of those settings through group policy. But like most settings in group policy, whoever is in our security team, they would have decided these computers need their hard drive encrypted. Maybe these other computers do not need hard drive level encryption. They would decide PIN length and additional authentication, all those settings. We would simply implement that through group policy. So pretty fascinating concepts.